This is Congress. This is the third module for the material from March 15th to 19th. And the last major subject that we're covering in this material is the question of how the change in media and the nature of the media that forms part of the electoral and therefore the representative environment of Congress. And of course, this is based on the Robinson article, and its amplification and in some ways supplementation in the last part of Chapter 5 of Davidson and Olazek. And you have to remember that this article is nearly 30 years old. It was published in the mid-90s. Did I do the math right? Mid-30s to mid-10 years. 25 years, I guess. Math wasn't my strong suit. But I still use it because, first of all, it is profoundly informative. The core of its information is still accurate, and his generalizations, I think, are still obtained to the Congress that has emerged in the last couple of decades. In other words, the Congress that he describes in its immediate environment that he describes in the mid-90s is essentially the same as today's, with, of course, the caveat or the addition of the internet, which was really, I know for those of you born after 2000, this might be astounding, but the internet first really became part of everyone's life really in the early 90s, and then with the kind of fleshing out of the browser wars, really by the mid-90s, the internet had become a part of not only our general media environment, but had become part, it was beginning to be part of the congressional media environment. And some of Robinson's descriptions may seem quaint because he talks about the rise of fax machines, of copying machines, which seems like ancient technology to anyone born after 1950. But of course, the other major development in addition to the internet was the rise of social media. But again, where does that fit in terms of his framework? It fits in terms of in-house media and to some degree campaign media. And it has, in fact, the main qualification that I would make is, aside from in my opinion, the generally destructive effect of social media on the political environment, political culture of the United States, which I think has made the political culture more volatile, more polarized, not in a good way, more intolerant, and more ignorant, by the way, because it has tended to replace narrative with fact. Among other things, but it turns out that Congress and members of Congress, as an institution and as individuals, have adopted very readily to the communicative possibilities of the internet and social media. So again, you can look to Chapter 5 to kind of fill out the aspect of that aspect, and of course, every member of Congress, senators and representatives, have websites and email has made mass mailings, which Robinson does talk about, which the rise of office technology in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, like the fax machine, like copying, like signature machine, all those kinds of things which are early stage office technology, had been in place by when he wrote this article. But of course, the use of television is the main thing, because just to remind you of a bit of history, television was invented in 1922, but it wasn't until after World War II and the 1950s that the vast majority of American households had television. And again, I don't mean to turn this into a history of media, but there is a certain sense in which the addition of television to the environment of the House, first in 1977 and the Senate in the mid-80s, somewhat changed the inner workings of the institutions, as we shall see when we turn to the legislative function of Congress and the inner dimensions of Congress, because those have also been modified, as you will see, by the unintended consequences of reforms. Even though Congress, of course, is substantially the same institution it was, substantially, as the framers designed it, obviously our politics are quite different, and in some ways the institutional environments are different. But Congress itself as an institution is in some ways profoundly different. That was my cat who's not my cat, Frozen. Let me see what she needs. She probably wants to be let out, even though she could let herself out perfectly well with the cat door. But excuse me one second. I don't know what she wanted. Anyway, the institution is the same, but both the electoral environment, as we saw in chapters 3 and 4, where campaign finance reform, which came into being to reform certain aspects of the electoral environment in Congress, but had profound unintended effects on other aspects. Again, just to summarize the main point, it severed to some degree members of Congress from the party organizations that were at one time the main source of funding and direction of their campaigns, and turned members of Congress into independent fundraisers who have to manage or hire managers for their own campaigns, and in some ways, especially through the rise of PACs, made the funding environment between members of Congress and individual interests and factions in their constituencies much more direct. We're going to see that some of the unintended consequences of internal reform, which changed the way that the legislative function of Congress works, especially the sunshine legislation of the 70s, more about that in a couple of weeks, it turns out not only made Congress more visible, for better or worse. For instance, there's all kinds of studies that show when television was added to the floor, there are all kinds of interesting aspects of that. But it clearly, and Robinson somewhat talks about that in this environment, it rewarded more media abilities and PR types, and that PR became a much more salient part of the congressional environment, although there's a kind of a Fenno-esque reflection at the end of Robinson's article. But the sunshine legislation that essentially opened up the committee process to outside view, which we're going to see when we turn to the committees in Chapter 7, how this changed. It also made the process of writing and drafting legislation much more permeable and accessible to special interests. When you combine that openness, which means really greater access to special interests, in the very heart of the legislative process, when you combine that with the greater independence and self-conducted campaigns and fundraising, you have a Congress which in some ways you have forced members of Congress not only to campaign all the time, but to go directly to particular interests in their districts for funding. And of course the whole rise of nonprofit funding has somewhat changed that too, as Chapter 4 discusses. But at the same time that you've opened up the core of the legislative process, not only to the public, which sounds good in practice, but the people that really benefited from that was the special interests have a much greater capacity to pay attention and motive to pay attention to pieces of legislation in their formation, and so again, Congress is essentially the same institution that the framers designed, but it's also gone through profound changes, as we saw in Chapter 2. And in particular, the unintended consequences of reform may have perhaps undermined some of its core functionings. That's a question we'll move to as we... And by the way, as you'll see, Robinson has some take on that. He argues that in some ways the institution operates differently today because of changes in the media. And we'll briefly go over those. But that, as you'll see, the main interesting speculation that Robinson makes possible or suggests is that the change in media has actually undermined the public image, which doesn't simply explain real changes in functioning or dysfunction in the Congress. But one possibility is, as I've already suggested, is that the institution is better than it looks, and that Americans, and there are two aspects of this, as you'll see when we come to the news media, that it may explain things like why they hate the institution, but then why they tend to vote for their individual member, for reasons that we'll see. So Robinson suggests, and he may be right, that that the change in media really has affected the institution, probably partially explaining the rise of incumbency in the House, but also, again, has damaged the confidence because of the way the institution is portrayed in the national media. Well, let's just cut to the chase there. So at any rate, let's walk through the major aspects of his article. and one of the things, so just let me say that the connection between the material in chapter 5 towards the end and the Robinson piece is a kind of an updating, which again, in my opinion, confirms the tendencies that he'd already seen with the rise, especially of campaign media, in-house media, and those tendencies that he describes in those parts of his article are even further reinforced by the addition of the internet and social media. So anyway, what you discover, of course, is that the first thing that he talks about is the attitude on the part of almost everyone in Congress. Now, this is a generational thing. You're talking about members of Congress in the 1980s and 90s, who, of course, were there long enough to remember Congress in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. And the great change, so the first thing that he reports, and then he'll come back to this at the end of his article, is the change in the national media, the attitude of the national media, not only to Congress, but to the institutions of government in general. And scholars of the presidency have noted that, for instance, the national media are much more critical, much more intolerant of, and much more investigative, which means in some ways not just great, truth is great and it's greater to know more truth, but that scandal-oriented is really what the first part of the article suggests, the change in the disposition. Of course, what was the titanic event that led to the change in national media was, of course, Watergate. Now, it was directed to a particular individual this is, say, Nixon in the White House. And there's no question that the media, in some ways, in the same way that much of the national media were anti-Trump, there was no question that much of the national media was anti-Nixon. But the point here is that led to a change in the attitude towards our governing institutions in general. And the president is probably more able to manage these things depending on the skills of the individual. And we'll see that the Biden presidency is just unfolding in that respect. Trump was a skilled media individual because, of course, that was part of his background. Reagan was a skilled media person. And LBJ in some ways, but in Kennedy. And that's where the connection between the presidency and the televised media really began to emerge in the Kennedy presidency, not only because he was so charismatic and so articulate and so photogenic or telegenic, but of course the 1960 presidential debates were the first televised debates, which have become part of our standard culture now. So with respect to Congress, you're going to see that in some ways that more adversarial, that more scandal-oriented, that more critical attitude has been to the disservice of the institution, because even though the presidency and individual presidents can often counteract the kind of change in the media that Robinson reports, Congress as an institution, remember, has no coherent central focus. The single-person dimension of the presidency can mean that if the president's not adept, again, the media can be very damaging. But if the president is an adept media type, then he or she can often overcome those disadvantages. But Congress, remember, always looks like a potential mob meeting. It's first of all, it's bicameral structure plus the different focus of leadership within the Congress, and we'll turn to some aspects of that leadership in Chapter 6, which details the party and leadership structure in Congress. Generally speaking, the greater scrutiny of the institution has led to at least part of the decline of the national image of Congress, because Congress is naturally harder to cover, looks messier, and as I've already suggested, has actually become a messier institution in some ways, both in terms of the electoral environment and the internal environment. At any rate, so after that introduction to the change in the mood of the national media, and this is critical to understanding Robinson's point, so you learn that there are the three faces of congressional media, which actually, when you see especially how he treats the third one, the news media, the news environment, the independent reporting environment, the news media, that there are actually 3.5 faces. Because it turns out that Robinson tells you that you have to distinguish, which oftentimes commentators don't or observers don't, between the national media, whose disposition has changed in the way we've already described, and that covers the institution, and the local news media, which cover the individual member. And it turns out those two components of the national media have quite different attitudes, quite different dispositions, and lead to quite different kinds of coverage of the institution as a whole on the national level and the individual member on the state and local level. So the three faces, campaign media, actually we should do in-house first because he does. And this arose or grew out of what was called a franking privilege as part of a representative's necessity of maintaining a link, like mailing regular campaign mailings, and there was a budget for that, and of course that's increased. And the televisionization and the internetization of that has actually led to even greater expenditures. And so in some ways, the franking privilege, mailing, the funded websites, and social media and all that, there's no question that leads to a kind of incumbent advantage. Now, Robinson weighs the relative advantages to challengers and incumbents, but his judgment is overall this environment benefits incumbents because it gives them a kind of a natural paid PR apparatus. Now, again, this is in the name of informing their constituents, but there's no question it gives incumbents clearly a visible advantage of visibility, because now, and you'll see when we towards the end of the course, when we start weighing possibilities for reform, if Congress needs that, and what kinds of reform, probably the most, as I've already mentioned from the beginning of the class, and as most of you already know, probably the single most touted reform of Congress is term limits. And as we're going to see, that not only may change the internal dynamic of Congress and its ability to perform its constitutional functions, not only of legislation, but later on in the course we'll talk about executive oversight. But if you're going to argue for term limits, you kind of have to weigh this other advantage. Now, some people would say putting term limits would actually level the playing field because it would take away some of the advantages that the in-house media give to the incumbent. So, by the way, as a nice, on page 70 through 72, you might want to look at that discussion about in-house media and campaign media. What was the quote I wanted to look at? That it's created a new electoral environment, and you can look at ways in which that's argued, probably favorable to the incumbent, as we saw. The campaign media also, both party organizations and caucuses or conferences in both chambers, also fund senatorial and House campaigns, and in some, for instance, very visible Senate campaigns, that funding is not inconsequential, as we've seen in the last couple of years. So the third kind, of course, is the news environment. And so let's concentrate on that because I think that's where he pours most of his explanatory efforts. So again, we've already seen how the news media, I should say the two different kinds of news media, local versus national, how they operate and why they produce different effects on the institution and the members. Again, we've already seen that the change in national media was that it became more scrutinizing, more investigative, more and more scandal-driven, I think is how some of the observers call it. The local media, so by the way, here's the point, is that Congress as an institution is dependent upon the news media for its public image as an institution, whereas the local media are often dependent upon the member. In other words, the two forms of media reverse dependency, and that local news outlets, whose primary drive is to find stories and coverage, tend to be less scrutinizing, less critical, and more, as I said, more dependent for news feeds for the local member. As a result, the coverage of the individual member tends to be much more favorable as an individual and may contribute to incumbency, as Robinson suggests. Whereas, again, the declining approval rating and the general disapproval of that Americans feel towards the institution as a whole may be part of more appearance than reality. But here's the problem, of course, in a republic and in a popular form of government, the proper functioning of the institutions, assuming they really aren't dysfunctional or really are tyrannical, there is a certain sense in which their proper functioning depends on a certain confidence of the public in them. And if there's this structural disadvantage or this structural distortion of the way Congress operates, and the images that that the national media present, then you could argue that the explanatory value of looking at the media in terms of why Americans think so poorly of their Congress, again, may be one of appearance rather than reality. And the different operation of the two media may explain the puzzle, the irony of Americans hating Congress but loving their individual member, and again, the rise of incumbency. So, let's look at his conclusion and kind of summarize what he finds. On page 95, in the final analysis, the changes in congressional media over the last 20 years have produced mixed blessings and not just a few ironies for Congress, for its members, and for us. For the House membership, the changes have meant greater safety, but at the same time greater anxiety about getting reelected. And this you might want to connect with Fenno and Homestyle. Because remember, one of the things Fenno reports is that members of Congress, no matter how many times they've been reelected, whether they're freshmen or veteran, whether they're that they always feel unsafe, even in their own safe districts. So even if the objective measures suggest that there are more safe districts and that incumbents are generally safer and can be assured of reelection unless they do something terrible, it may also be, as Fenno reports, that even though they are objectively safer, subjectively they don't feel that, and even with all the change in the media, they still feel the need to reach out and create, as I said, this home style, this political professional persona. For the senators, changes in media mix have meant less safety because, of course, senators come from generally larger districts, except in those states which are small enough that you have 2 senators and 1 representative for the whole state. But generally speaking, the state is larger, greater population, greater heterogeneity, and more of a dependence upon the television and campaign media. So there might be a slightly different effect between the House and the Senate on this. At the same time, greater opportunities for achieving national prominence. That's definitely true. And in a way, as we saw with Fenno, with the 5th constituency that he sees with the Senate, and as we saw with Madison in the Federalist Papers, the expectation that senators would be both more attentive to the nation and more the subject of national attention, that's been borne out by the developments in media. On the last page of the article, the media generally benefit, this is his concluding paragraph, the media generally benefit public people, not public institutions. For the most part, the new media mix has rendered Congress no less safe, but a little less serviceable. The members no less important, but Congress a little less viable. The major impact of the modern media in Congress has not been the result of post-Watergate journalism, but the inevitable consequence of focusing more public attention on elected officials, all of whom owe their jobs to local constituencies. The media have made congressmen, members of Congress, somewhat more anxious, somewhat more adept at media manipulation, and somewhat more responsive to local interests. But this merely shows us that Congress and its membership have a highly democratic base. What the newer media have done to Congress is one would expect when the level of information concerning an essentially democratic institution increases. Greater responsiveness to the locals and greater concerns about saving oneself. In all that, there is obviously good news and bad. So that's summarizing the major effects. These are part of my own notes on the article, as you can tell. Perhaps the rise in safer districts in the House explaining some of incumbency and less safety in the Senate. more visible media types. It's increased the PR component of being a member of Congress, which means, by the way, if you kind of go to that nice quote at the beginning of Chapter 5 by Grandy, the former Republican from Iowa, that serving in Congress is great if you have no life, if that's all you want to do from morning to evening, that these are busy people, and that the pie graph of their total energy, depending, as you'll see it when we look at Fenno's book, really changes from member to some degree, but as a reliable generalization, forcing members to pay more attention to their media components and turning and encouraging more PR types obviously detracts from other parts of their ability to function. And again, one could look at that and say pretty cynically and saying, well, okay, that just means that especially the campaign and in-house media have become more like permanent public relations or advertising agencies. And there's something to that. Whether that's good or bad, and why it's good or bad, and how it's good and bad, partially depends upon, again, I would point that back to Fenno. And that in some ways, remember, Fenno has this kind of soberly cautious affirmation of the representative character of members of Congress and the institution as a whole. And again, as I've already mentioned, more time on public media relations, less on deliberation, which has, as you're going to see, has become formalized because of changes in the committee system and the party system that we'll see. And again, perhaps the greatest effect is to create a systemically and permanently unfavorable view of the institution in the eyes of the American public. Again, the last part of Chapter 5 in the Robinson article make clear that the media connection, the media environment of Congress and of members of Congress is a critical part of the representative link and the environment that helps channel and function and shape the representative function of Congress too.